Have you ever wondered what happens when a single decision changes the course of history? When one person's choice to help becomes an act of rebellion that could cost them everything? What I'm about to share with you will challenge everything you thought you knew about courage, love, and the price of standing up for what's right when the world has gone completely mad. Picture this. It's 1943, and Europe is drowning in darkness. The Nazi war machine has swept across the continent like a plague, crushing everything in its path. Cities lie in ruins. Families have been torn apart. And in the shadows of this nightmare, ordinary people are forced to make extraordinary choices that will define not just their own fate, but the fate of history itself. This is the story of Alina Morrow, a 26-year-old Parisian who should have been planning her wedding, discussing children with her fiancé, living the quiet life she had always dreamed of. Instead, she found herself carrying secrets that could topple governments, delivering messages that could save or destroy lives, walking a razor's edge between heroism and treason every single day. But Alina's story isn't just about resistance and rebellion. It's about something far more dangerous, far more forbidden. It's about what happens when your heart betrays everything you've been taught to believe. When love blooms in the most impossible circumstances. When caring for someone becomes the most dangerous thing you could possibly do. Before we dive into this extraordinary tale, let me tell you why this story matters more than you might think. This isn't just another war story. This isn't just another romance. This is a testament to the power of individual choice when everything around you is designed to crush the human spirit. Alina's journey from ordinary citizen to underground courier to something far more complex will show you how quickly life can change when you decide to stop being a bystander and start being a participant in your own destiny. I spent months researching this account, piecing together fragments from declassified intelligence reports, personal letters that somehow survived the war, and testimonies from the few people who knew Alina personally and lived to tell her story. What I discovered was a tale so incredible, so heart-wrenching, and so impossible that it reads like fiction. But every detail is real. Every stolen moment, every whispered conversation, every life-or-death decision actually happened in the streets of occupied Paris and the countryside between France and England. The documents I uncovered reveal not just Alina's story, but the entire network of ordinary people who risked everything to fight against tyranny. Teachers who became spies, shopkeepers who became smugglers, housewives who became heroes, and at the center of it all, a young woman whose courage would be tested in ways she never could have imagined. Alina had grown up believing in simple things, right and wrong, good and evil, love and loyalty. The war shattered those beliefs like glass, forcing her to navigate a world where nothing was black and white, where every choice carried consequences she couldn't predict, where survival itself became an act of defiance. Her journey began not with grand declarations or dramatic moments, but with a simple act of kindness that spiraled into something far beyond her control. It was a cold morning in February when Alina first encountered the resistance network that would change her life forever. She had been walking to work at the small bookshop where she spent her days, trying to maintain some semblance of normal life in a world gone insane. The bookshop itself was a remnant of peacetime Paris, filled with volumes that spoke of better days and brighter futures. Alina had always found comfort among the books, surrounded by stories of love and adventure that seemed to belong to another universe entirely. The customers who still came were mostly older people, seeking escape in literature when reality had become too harsh to bear. It was there, shelving poetry collections that no one read anymore, that Alina first heard the whispered conversations that would pull her into a world of secrets and shadows. Two elderly men discussing what seemed like innocent topics, but their words carried layers of meaning that only became clear when you understood the context. They spoke of packages that needed delivery, of routes that had become dangerous, of friends who had simply vanished one day without explanation. Alina might have ignored these conversations entirely if not for what happened next. One of the men, Monsieur Dubois, collapsed near the philosophy section, clutching his chest as his face turned pale with pain. Elena rushed to help him, calling for a doctor, providing what comfort she could while they waited for medical assistance. It was a simple human response to someone in distress, nothing more. But in helping Monsieur Dubois, Elena discovered something that would change the trajectory of her entire existence. Hidden in his coat pocket was a letter, written in code, containing information that she couldn't understand but somehow knew was important beyond measure. When Dubois recovered enough to speak, he looked into Elena's eyes with an intensity that made her heart race. He asked her a question that seemed innocent on the surface, but carried implications that reached far deeper. He wanted to know if she believed that some things were worth risking everything for, if she thought there were causes that justified putting your own safety aside for the good of others, if she had ever considered what she would do if called upon to make a difference in the world. Elena's answer in that moment was honest and immediate. She told him that she had always believed in doing what was right, even when it was difficult, that she couldn't stand by and watch injustice without at least trying to help, that her conscience wouldn't allow her to be a passive observer when action was needed. Dubois studied her face for a long moment, as if weighing her words against something only he could see. Then he made a decision that would pull Elena into a world she had never imagined, a world where ordinary people performed extraordinary acts of courage on a daily basis. He told her about the network. Not everything, but enough to paint a picture of what was really happening beneath the surface of occupied Paris. There were people working in secret to help others escape Nazi persecution. Messages that needed to be carried between safe houses. Information that could save lives if it reached the right hands at the right time. The network needed couriers, people who could move through the city without attracting attention, who could carry documents and packages without arousing suspicion. Young women like Elena were particularly valuable because they were often overlooked by German patrols, dismissed as harmless civilians going about their daily business. Elena listened to Dubois explain the work with a mixture of fascination and terror. This was exactly the kind of meaningful action she had always claimed she would take if given the opportunity. But now that the opportunity was presenting itself, she realized how much courage it would actually require. The risks were enormous and immediate. Couriers who were caught faced torture, imprisonment, or execution. Families could be punished for the actions of their relatives. Even success in one mission offered no guarantee of safety in the next. Every day would be a gamble with stakes higher than most people ever faced in their entire lives. But there was something else Dubois told her that made the decision even more complicated. The network wasn't just helping French citizens escape persecution. They were also working with Allied intelligence services, gathering information about German military movements, sabotaging enemy operations when possible. This wasn't just humanitarian work. It was active resistance against the occupation. Elena found herself facing a choice that would define everything that came after. She could return to her quiet life at the bookshop, pretending she had never heard about the network, continuing to exist in the small bubble of safety she had managed to maintain. Or she could step forward into danger, accepting responsibility for actions that could help turn the tide of war but might also cost her everything she held dear. The decision she made in that moment would set in motion a chain of events that would test her courage, challenge her beliefs, and ultimately force her to confront questions about love and loyalty that she had never expected to face. Elena chose to join the resistance, not knowing that this choice would lead her down a path toward the most dangerous mission of her life, a journey that would take her from Paris to London and back again, carrying secrets that could change the course of history. But Elena's story was just beginning, and the challenges ahead would prove far more complex than anything Dubois had described in that initial conversation. Because sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one wearing a uniform, but the one who makes you question everything you thought you knew about right and wrong, about duty and desire, about the price of following your heart when your heart leads you into forbidden territory. Alina's first mission came 3 days after her meeting with Dubois, and it was designed to test her nerve rather than her skills. She was to carry a single envelope across Paris, from a café in Montmartre to a small apartment near the Sorbonne. The route would take her through 2 German checkpoints, past patrols that had become increasingly aggressive in their searches of civilians. The envelope felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in her handbag as she walked through streets that had once been familiar, but now seemed filled with hidden dangers. Every German uniform she spotted made her heart race. Every glance from a soldier made her wonder if somehow they could see through her carefully constructed facade of innocence. But Alina discovered something remarkable during that first mission. The fear that had consumed her thoughts while preparing for the task began to transform into something else entirely as she moved through the city. Focus, clarity, a heightened awareness of everything around her that felt almost supernatural in its intensity. She noticed details that had escaped her attention for months. The way certain shopkeepers watched the street with more attention than their businesses required. The subtle hand signals that passed between people who appeared to be strangers. The routes that pedestrians unconsciously avoided, steering clear of buildings that looked innocent but somehow felt dangerous. By the time Alina delivered her first package successfully, she understood that she had stumbled into a world that existed parallel to the one most people inhabited. A shadow Paris where information flowed through hidden channels, where ordinary conversations carried coded meanings, where survival depended on reading signs that were invisible to untrained eyes. The apartment where she made her delivery was unremarkable from the outside, just another building in a neighborhood full of students and intellectuals. But the woman who answered the door, Madame Rousseau, possessed the same quality Alina had noticed in Dubois. An intensity that suggested depths of experience most people never acquired. Madame Rousseau invited Alina inside for tea, and during their conversation, Alina began to understand the true scope of what she had joined. The resistance network wasn't just a local operation limited to Paris. It was part of a vast web of connections that stretched across occupied Europe, linking isolated cells of fighters into a coordinated effort that was far more sophisticated than anything she had imagined. There were safe houses in every major city, communication networks that could carry messages across hundreds of miles without using official postal or telegraph services, supply lines that moved everything from forged documents to medical supplies to weapons. And at the center of it all, ordinary people who had chosen to risk everything rather than submit to tyranny. Alina learned that her role as a courier was just the beginning. If she proved reliable in simple message delivery, there would be opportunities for more complex assignments, document forgery, intelligence gathering, even direct action against German installations when circumstances required it. But Madame Rouse also explained the psychological challenges that came with resistance work. The constant stress of maintaining cover identities, the emotional toll of losing friends and colleagues to enemy action, the way that living a double life could gradually erode your sense of who you really were beneath all the deception and performance. Most difficult of all was the isolation. Alina could never discuss her real activities with her family, her friends from before the war, or anyone outside the network. The work demanded absolute secrecy, which meant that the most important parts of her life had to remain completely hidden from the people she cared about most. Over the following weeks, Alina threw herself into her new role with an intensity that surprised even her. She memorized street maps until she could navigate Paris blindfolded. She practiced maintaining calm expressions while carrying documents that could get her shot if discovered. She learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated whether a location was safe or had been compromised. The bookshop became her perfect cover, providing a legitimate reason to be anywhere in the city at any time. Customers who needed books delivered, suppliers who required visits to their warehouses, literary events that explained her presence in neighborhoods where she had no obvious business being. Alina's natural intelligence and attention to detail made her exceptionally good at the work. She could memorize complex verbal messages after hearing them only once. She developed an instinct for detecting surveillance that kept her safe when less experienced couriers might have walked into traps. Most importantly, she possessed the kind of steady nerves that allowed her to function normally even in the most dangerous situations. But success in courier work brought increasing responsibility, and increasing responsibility meant exposure to more sensitive information. Alina began carrying documents that revealed the full scope of Allied operations in occupied France. Intelligence reports about German troop movements, plans for sabotage operations that could cripple enemy supply lines, communications between resistance cells that were coordinating major actions. The weight of these secrets was enormous. Alina found herself lying awake at night, thinking about the lives that depended on the information she carried, the operations that could succeed or fail based on whether she completed her mission successfully. The responsibility was both exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. It was during one of these sleepless nights that Alina first heard about the London assignment. Madame Rousseau had mentioned it casually, almost as an afterthought during one of their regular meetings. There was a need for someone to carry critical intelligence directly to Allied command in England. The mission would require crossing enemy lines, evading German patrols, and making contact with British agents who could arrange transportation across the English Channel. The assignment was far more dangerous than anything Alina had attempted before. Previous missions had kept her within Paris, where she knew every street and alley, where she had established routines that provided cover for her activities. This would take her into unknown territory, away from the support network that had kept her safe for months. But the intelligence that needed to reach London was apparently so important that normal communication channels weren't sufficient. Radio transmissions could be intercepted. Coded messages sent through other networks might not arrive in time. Only a personal courier could guarantee that the information would reach its destination quickly and securely. Alina's first reaction was to volunteer immediately. The mission represented exactly the kind of meaningful action she had imagined when she first joined the resistance. A chance to make a real difference in the war effort, to contribute something significant to the cause she had come to believe in so deeply. But Madame Rousseau cautioned her to think carefully before accepting. This wasn't just another delivery across Paris. The journey would take weeks, passing through territory controlled by German forces who were actively hunting for resistance operatives. The penalties for being caught with the kind of intelligence she would be carrying went far beyond anything she had risked before. More importantly, the mission would require Alina to work closely with British agents, whose methods and priorities might be very different from those of the French resistance. She would be operating outside the familiar network that had protected her, depending on people she had never met, trusting her life to strangers who might have their own agendas that didn't necessarily align with her safety. Alina spent 3 days considering the assignment, weighing the risks against the potential impact of delivering the intelligence successfully. During those days, she found herself thinking not just about the immediate dangers of the mission, but about what it would mean for her future. If she survived the London assignment, there would inevitably be others. More dangerous operations, greater responsibilities, deeper involvement in activities that moved further and further away from anything resembling a normal life. But when she finally gave Madame Rousseau her answer, Alina discovered that the decision had really been made the moment she first heard about the mission. She had crossed too many lines already to turn back now. The quiet bookshop clerk who had existed before the war was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that some things were worth any risk, any sacrifice, any price that circumstances might demand. What Alina didn't know as she accepted the London assignment was that the mission would test far more than her courage or her skills as a courier. The intelligence she would be carrying contained secrets that reached to the highest levels of both Allied and German command structures. Information so sensitive that there were people on both sides of the war who would kill to obtain it or to prevent it from reaching its destination. And somewhere between Paris and London, Alina would encounter someone who would force her to question everything she thought she knew about loyalty, about duty, about the clear lines that separated friends from enemies in wartime. Someone who would make her realize that the most dangerous battles aren't always fought with weapons, but with the human heart when it discovers something worth more than victory, more than survival, more than all the causes that had seemed so important just moments before. The preparation for the London mission would take 2 weeks, during which Alina would learn skills that went far beyond simple message delivery. Skills that would transform her from a courier into something much more dangerous, much more valuable, and much more vulnerable than she had ever imagined possible. She had ever imagined possible. The training Alina underwent during those 2 weeks transformed her understanding of what it meant to be a resistance operative. What had begun as simple courier work evolved into something far more sophisticated and deadly. Madame Rouse introduced her to specialists who had been fighting this shadow war since the early days of the occupation, men and women who had perfected techniques that could mean the difference between life and death behind enemy lines. Alina learned to forge documents with a precision that would fool even experienced German officials. She practiced altering her appearance in ways that could make her virtually unrecognizable from one day to the next. Different hairstyles, makeup techniques that changed the apparent shape of her face, clothing choices that could make her seem older or younger, wealthier or poorer, depending on what the situation required. But the most crucial skills were psychological. Alina discovered that successful deception required more than just props and costumes. It demanded the ability to inhabit different personalities completely, to think and react as someone entirely different from who she really was. She learned to control her breathing, her posture, even the way she moved her hands when nervous, understanding that the smallest unconscious gesture could betray her true identity to trained observers. The intelligence she would be carrying to London consisted of more than just documents. Alina was taught to memorize vast amounts of information that could be reconstructed even if her physical materials were discovered and destroyed. Names, dates, locations, troop movements, supply schedules, all committed to memory using techniques that allowed perfect recall under even the most stressful circumstances. What struck Alina most during this training was how ordinary her instructors appeared. They could have been shopkeepers, teachers, accountants from her neighborhood, yet each possessed skills that would have impressed professional spies and military officers. The war had created an entire population of experts in deception, people who had learned to hide in plain sight while conducting operations that could influence the fate of nations. The route to London had been planned with meticulous attention to detail. Alina would travel by train from Paris to Lyon, then make her way through the countryside toward the Swiss border. From there, she would cross into neutral territory before circling back through eastern France toward the coast. The journey would take her through a dozen different cover identities, each supported by forged papers that had been crafted to withstand careful inspection. At each stage of the journey, Alina would make contact with different resistance cells who would provide assistance, shelter, and updated intelligence about German activities in their areas. But she was warned that these contacts represented both her greatest asset and her greatest vulnerability. Each person who knew about her mission was a potential point of failure if they were captured and interrogated by enemy forces. The night before her departure, Alina sat in her small apartment, looking at possessions that suddenly seemed to belong to someone else entirely. The books she had collected over the years, photographs of family and friends from peacetime, letters from her fiancé who had been killed during the invasion, all felt like artifacts from a life she barely remembered living. She packed a single small suitcase with items that supported her first cover identity as a seamstress traveling to Lyon to work in a textile factory. The clothes were chosen for practicality, rather than style, sturdy fabrics that would wear well during the long journey ahead. Hidden throughout her belongings were the documents and materials she would need for subsequent identities, concealed so skillfully that even a thorough search might not reveal their existence. The most dangerous part of her cargo was sewn into the lining of her coat, microfilm containing photographs of German military installations, troop deployment orders, and communication intercepts that revealed the location of a major Wehrmacht ammunition depot. If this intelligence reached London successfully, it could enable bombing raids that would severely disrupt German operations across northern France. Alina understood that she was carrying information valuable enough to justify extraordinary efforts to stop her. German intelligence services would have agents watching transportation hubs, border crossings, and any location where resistance operatives might seek assistance. Her success would depend on moving through this network of surveillance without triggering the attention that would bring down the full weight of enemy security forces. The train to Lyon departed at dawn, and Alina found herself sharing a compartment with 3 other passengers who seemed as nervous as she felt. An elderly man reading a newspaper with hands that shook slightly, a middle-aged woman clutching a handbag as if it contained her entire life savings, a young soldier on leave whose eyes held the hollow look of someone who had seen too much combat. Alina forced herself to maintain the personality of her seamstress cover identity, making small talk about fabric shortages and the difficulty of finding quality thread. But beneath the surface conversation, she was constantly analyzing her fellow passengers, the conductor who checked their papers, the German officers who boarded periodically to inspect documents and search luggage. The first checkpoint came 2 hours outside Paris, and Alina's heart hammered against her ribs as uniformed soldiers moved through the train car. Her forged papers identified her as Marie Dubois, age 24, unmarried, traveling to Lyon for employment at a factory that produced military uniforms. The story was simple enough to be believable, but detailed enough to withstand casual questioning. When the German officer examined her documents, Alina maintained the slightly nervous demeanor appropriate for a young woman traveling alone during wartime. She answered his questions in accented German that suggested some education, but not the fluency that might make him suspicious about her background. The inspection lasted less than 3 minutes, but those minutes felt like hours as Alina waited to discover whether her new identity would hold up under official scrutiny. The officer returned her papers with a nod that suggested she had passed his evaluation successfully. Alina allowed herself a small smile of relief while being careful not to appear too confident. In the world of resistance operations, overconfidence could be as dangerous as obvious nervousness when it came to maintaining cover identities. As the train continued toward Lyon, Alina began to understand why experienced operatives spoke about long-distance missions as journeys into unknown territory. Every mile took her further from the familiar support network that had kept her safe during her months as a Paris courier. She was moving into regions where she had no established contacts, no safe houses to retreat to if something went wrong, no backup plans if her primary identity was compromised. The landscape outside the train windows changed gradually from the urban sprawl surrounding Paris to countryside that bore the scars of military occupation. Villages with boarded-up shops and empty streets, farms where German soldiers had established checkpoints to monitor civilian movement, industrial facilities that had been converted to produce materials for the war effort rather than civilian goods. Alina found herself studying the faces of other passengers, wondering how many were what they appeared to be and how many were fellow travelers in the shadow world of resistance and espionage. The war had created a population of people living double lives, maintaining surface identities while pursuing secret agendas that could range from simple survival to sophisticated intelligence operations. In Lyon, Alina's first contact was a baker named Henry Morrow, who operated from a shop in the old quarter of the city. The recognition signals had been established in advance through a complex system of passwords and responses, but actually implementing them in real-world conditions proved more challenging than Alina had anticipated during training. Henry appeared to be a simple tradesman, concerned only with flour shortages and fuel rationing. But his eyes held the same intensity Alina had learned to recognize in resistance operatives, and his casual questions about her journey contained layers of meaning that confirmed his true role in the network supporting her mission. The safe house Henry provided was a room above his bakery that could be accessed through a hidden entrance behind stacked flour barrels. Alina spent 2 days there while Henry gathered intelligence about German activities along her planned route toward the Swiss border. What he discovered was troubling enough to require significant changes to her original plan. German security forces had recently arrested several resistance operatives in the border region, and their interrogations had apparently revealed enough information to compromise multiple escape routes. Checkpoints had been reinforced with additional personnel who were conducting more thorough searches of travelers. Most concerning, there were reports of German agents posing as resistance contacts to trap operatives attempting to cross into neutral territory. Henry proposed an alternative route that would take Alina north toward Belgium before circling back toward the coast through territory that remained relatively secure. The journey would add a week to her travel time and require her to assume 2 additional cover identities, but it offered a much better chance of reaching her destination without capture. Alina agreed to the route change, while understanding that each additional day of travel increased the risk she faced exponentially. More opportunities for her cover identities to be challenged, more chances for random encounters that could expose her true mission, more time for German intelligence services to identify and track her movements through their surveillance networks. The new route would also take her through territory where she would need to work with resistance cells that operated very differently from the sophisticated urban network she had known in Paris. Rural operatives who relied more on local knowledge than on sophisticated forgery and deception techniques. Farmers and villagers who provided assistance when they could but had limited resources and training for supporting complex intelligence operations. As Alina prepared to leave Lyon with her new identity documents and updated mission parameters, she realized that she was crossing another threshold in her evolution from ordinary citizen to professional operative. Each stage of her journey was teaching her skills and revealing capabilities she had never known she possessed. But it was also taking her further away from any possibility of returning to the life she had known before the war. The woman who had volunteered to carry a simple message across Paris no longer existed. In her place was someone harder, more focused, more willing to accept risks that would have terrified her former self. Alina was discovering that war didn't just change the world around you, it changed who you were at the most fundamental level, until sometimes you barely recognized the person looking back at you from mirrors in safe houses and train station washrooms. But the most profound changes were still ahead of her, waiting in the forests between Belgium and the English Channel, where Alina would encounter someone who would force her to question everything she thought she knew about enemies and allies, about the price of victory, about what happened when the heart discovered something more important than any mission, any cause, any oath of loyalty she had ever sworn. The train that would take her toward that encounter was already waiting at the platform, steam rising from its engine like breath in the cold morning air. Alina checked her new papers one final time, adjusted her appearance to match her latest cover identity, and walked toward a future that would test every skill she had learned and every belief she had held about what it meant to be human in a world gone mad with hatred and war. The train to Brussels carried Alina through countryside that seemed frozen in a perpetual state of anxious waiting. Villages huddled around their ancient churches like children seeking protection from monsters they couldn't see but knew were lurking in the shadows. German military convoys moved along roads that paralleled the railway, their vehicles kicking up clouds of dust that settled on everything like a fine layer of occupation itself. Alina's new identity as Catherine Beaumont, a nurse traveling to assist at a field hospital near the Belgian border, required a different kind of performance than her previous roles. Where Marie the seamstress had been quietly nervous, Catherine needed to project competence and purpose. The forged credentials in her bag identified her as someone with medical training, which meant she had to be prepared to answer technical questions if challenged by suspicious officials. The character came naturally to her in ways that surprised Alina. Perhaps it was because Catherine's mission of healing felt closer to her true self than the deceptions she had been living. Or perhaps she was simply becoming more skilled at inhabiting whatever identity the situation required. The line between performance and reality was beginning to blur in ways that both impressed and unsettled her. A German medical officer boarded the train outside Reims, conducting what appeared to be a routine inspection of passengers claiming medical credentials. Alina watched him work his way through the car, questioning a Red Cross volunteer about supply shortages and challenging a doctor about his destination and purpose. When he reached her seat, Alina felt her pulse quicken despite her preparation for exactly this scenario. The officer examined her papers with the methodical attention of someone who had discovered false documents before. He asked about her training, her previous assignments, the specific conditions she expected to encounter at the field hospital. Alina answered with the precise mixture of knowledge and uncertainty that would be appropriate for a nurse with her supposed level of experience. But then the officer asked something that made Alina's blood freeze. He wanted to know about surgical procedures she would have witnessed, specific techniques that would be familiar to any nurse who had actually worked in military medical facilities. Alina realized that her preparation had focused on general medical knowledge without delving into the specialized practices of battlefield medicine. For a moment that felt like an eternity, Alina's mind went completely blank. The careful answers she had rehearsed vanished, leaving her staring at an officer whose suspicion was clearly growing with each second of her hesitation. She could feel other passengers watching the interaction, sensing tension without understanding its source. Then something remarkable happened. Alina found herself describing surgical procedures with vivid detail, explaining the challenges of operating under battlefield conditions, discussing the psychological toll of treating young soldiers who would never fully recover from their wounds. The words flowed from some deep place within her consciousness, as if she were drawing on memories that belonged to someone else entirely. The officer listened with growing interest rather than suspicion, occasionally nodding as Alina described situations that clearly matched his own experiences. When she finished speaking, he returned her documents with something that almost resembled respect. He had accepted not just her papers, but her entire identity as someone who had witnessed the same horrors that haunted his own memory. As the train continued toward Brussels, Alina tried to understand what had just happened. The medical knowledge she had displayed went far beyond anything she had learned during her brief training period. Yet the information had felt completely authentic as she spoke, as if she were recounting actual experiences rather than creating fictional scenarios. She wondered if this was how experienced operatives felt when they had been living double lives for so long that the boundaries between their various identities began to dissolve. Perhaps the person she was becoming had absorbed fragments from all the roles she had played, creating something new that was neither completely real nor completely false. Brussels greeted Alina with rain that turned its cobblestone streets into mirrors reflecting the gray sky above. The city carried scars from fighting that had occurred 3 years earlier, buildings with patched facades and windows that had been boarded up and never properly repaired. But life continued with the stubborn persistence that characterized occupied territories throughout Europe. Her contact in Brussels was a priest named Father Anton, who operated from a church in the Marls district. The recognition protocol required Alina to attend evening mass and approach him during confession with a specific phrase about seeking forgiveness for thoughts of vengeance against her enemies. The religious context felt both appropriate and deeply ironic given the nature of her actual mission. Father Anton listened to her coded confession, with the practiced patience of someone who had heard far more dangerous secrets than anything Alina carried. When she finished speaking, he assigned her a penance that included specific instructions about where to meet him after the service concluded. The entire exchange took less than 5 minutes, but Alina understood that she had just made contact with someone whose position allowed him to gather intelligence from sources throughout the occupied city. The priest's safe house was located in the basement of an orphanage that had been established to care for children whose parents had been killed or taken by German forces. Alina spent 3 days there, surrounded by youngsters who played games that mimicked the adult world of checkpoints and identity papers, who had learned to recognize the sound of different aircraft engines and could distinguish between German and Allied bombing raids. Father Anton provided Alina with intelligence that fundamentally altered her understanding of her mission. The information she was carrying to London was apparently more significant than she had been told during her initial briefing. German forces were planning a major offensive that could change the trajectory of the war, and the documents hidden in her coat contained details that could allow Allied command to prepare countermeasures. But there was something else Father Anton revealed that made Alina's blood run cold. German intelligence services had apparently learned about her mission through sources that remained unknown. They knew a high-value courier was traveling toward the English Channel, and they were deploying resources specifically designed to intercept her before she could complete her delivery. The priest explained that Alina's survival now depended on reaching her destination before German forces could identify and track her movements. The methodical approach that had served her well during the early stages of her journey would no longer be sufficient. She needed to move faster, take greater risks, and rely on contacts who specialized in the most dangerous types of resistance operations. Father Anton introduced Alina to a network of operatives who focused on direct action rather than intelligence gathering. These were the people who sabotaged railway lines, assassinated collaborators, and conducted raids against German installations. They operated with a level of violence and urgency that made Alina's courier work seem almost peaceful by comparison. The leader of this cell was a woman named Sylvie, who had once been a university professor, but now carried weapons with the same casual familiarity that she had once handled books and lecture notes. Sylvie possessed an intensity that reminded Alina of a coiled spring, someone who had learned to compress enormous amounts of energy into a deceptively calm exterior. Sylvie explained that getting Alina to the coast would require moving through territory where German forces were conducting active sweeps for resistance operatives. Normal travel methods would be too slow and too visible for someone with Alina's level of priority as a target. Instead, they would need to use routes and techniques that had been developed for moving high-value assets under the most dangerous possible circumstances. The plan Sylvie proposed involved Alina traveling with a team of operatives who were conducting their own mission against a German communications facility near the coast. She would be hidden among supplies being transported for what appeared to be a routine sabotage operation, but which would actually serve as cover for getting her within striking distance of her rendezvous point with British agents. Alina realized that accepting this assistance would fundamentally change the nature of her mission. Instead of being a lone courier carrying intelligence, she would become part of a military operation that involved direct combat with enemy forces. The skills she had learned for deception and evasion would need to be supplemented with knowledge of weapons, tactics, and combat procedures. Sylvie seemed to recognize Alina's hesitation and explained that there really wasn't any alternative. German forces were closing in on the network that had been supporting Alina's journey, and several safe houses along her planned route had been compromised. The sabotage mission represented her best remaining chance of reaching the coast before enemy agents could track her down. The training Alina received during her final days in Brussels was unlike anything she had experienced during her previous preparation. She learned to handle weapons with deadly efficiency, to move silently through terrain that offered minimal concealment, to communicate using hand signals that could coordinate complex operations without verbal communication. But the most important lessons were psychological. Sylvie explained that combat operations required a different mindset than intelligence work. The careful, methodical approach that served couriers well could prove fatal when split-second decisions meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Alina discovered that she possessed an aptitude for this type of work that surprised everyone, including herself. Her months of living under constant threat had developed reflexes and instincts that translated naturally into combat situations. She could assess tactical situations quickly, identify threats before they became immediate dangers, and maintain focus under pressure that would paralyze less experienced operatives. As Alina prepared for what would be the most dangerous phase of her journey, she reflected on how completely her life had changed since that morning when she first encountered Monsieur Dubois in the bookshop. The quiet woman who had shelved poetry and served customers tea had evolved into someone capable of carrying state secrets through enemy territory and participating in military operations against occupying forces. But the most profound transformation was still ahead of her. Because somewhere in the forests between Brussels and the English Channel, Alina would encounter someone who would force her to question everything she thought she knew about the nature of war itself. Someone who would make her realize that the most dangerous enemies weren't always the ones wearing different uniforms, and that the most important battles weren't always fought for the causes that seemed so clear from a distance. The mission that would take her to that encounter was scheduled to begin at dawn, when Sylvie's team would move out under cover of darkness toward their target. Alina checked her equipment one final time, verified that the intelligence she carried remained secure, and tried to prepare herself mentally for challenges that would test every skill she had learned, and every belief she held about duty, loyalty, and the price of victory in a world where nothing was ever as simple as it appeared. The forest outside Brussels stretched before Alina's team like a vast green ocean, frozen in perpetual twilight. Ancient oaks and towering pines created a canopy so dense that even midday felt like dusk, their branches interwoven in patterns that had remained unchanged for centuries before this war began, and would endure long after it ended. Alina moved through this primeval landscape with movements that had become instinctive during her weeks of training, each footstep placed with deliberate precision to avoid the dried leaves and brittle twigs that could betray their presence to enemy patrols. Sylvie led the team with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to read the forest's moods and rhythms as easily as others read newspapers. Behind her moved 4 other operatives, each carrying specialized equipment for their assault on the German communications facility. Alina brought up the rear, her role supposedly limited to observing the operation while using it as cover for reaching her coastal rendezvous point. But Alina quickly discovered that her position as an observer was largely theoretical. The intelligence she carried made her too valuable to risk in direct combat, yet too important to leave unprotected if the mission encountered unexpected complications. She found herself occupying an uncomfortable middle ground between participant and passenger, trained for violence but forbidden from using those skills except in the most desperate circumstances. The first day's march took them deep into territory that bore no signs of human habitation for miles in any direction. Alina had grown accustomed to the constant presence of other people during her months as an urban courier, and the complete isolation of the wilderness felt both liberating and deeply unsettling. Here, surrounded by trees that had witnessed centuries of human conflict, the war seemed both more immediate and strangely distant. They encountered their first evidence of German military presence just before sunset, when Sylvie called a halt near the edge of a clearing where tire tracks and boot prints revealed recent vehicle activity. The team spread out in a defensive formation, while Sylvie examined the signs with the methodical attention of someone reading a story written in disturbed earth and broken vegetation. Her analysis revealed that a German patrol had used this location as a rest stop within the past 48 hours. The number of cigarette butts and food containers suggested a squad of 8 to 10 soldiers who had remained in the area for several hours before moving deeper into the forest. Most concerning were the communication antenna fragments that indicated they had been in radio contact with higher command during their halt. Sylvie gathered her team for a whispered conference that would determine their next course of action. The German patrol's route intersected with their planned approach to the communications facility, which meant they would need to either alter their timeline significantly or accept the risk of encountering enemy forces under conditions that heavily favored the defenders. Alina listened to the tactical discussion with growing fascination at the complexity involved in even the simplest military operations. Every decision created cascading consequences that affected dozens of other variables, from ammunition consumption to escape route planning. The careful calculations required reminded her of the elaborate chess problems she had enjoyed solving during peacetime, except that mistakes in this game carried consequences far beyond losing pieces on a board. The team decided to continue with their original schedule while implementing additional security measures that would slow their progress but reduce the chances of unexpected contact with enemy forces. Alina found herself assigned to rear guard duty, a position that required her to watch for pursuit, while the main group focused on navigation and obstacle avoidance. The responsibility was both an honor and a burden. Alina understood that her teammates were trusting her with their lives, relying on her alertness to provide warning if German forces attempted to follow their trail. But she also knew that her lack of experience in forest operations made her the weakest link in their defensive chain. As darkness fell, the team established a cold camp in a depression between two ridgelines that provided concealment from observation, while offering multiple escape routes if discovery became unavoidable. Alina shared watch duties with the other operatives, spending 4-hour shifts listening to night sounds that gradually became familiar rather than threatening. During her second watch, Alina heard something that made her pulse quicken despite hours of peaceful forest silence. Voices carried on the wind, speaking in German, discussing patrol routes and search protocols. The conversation was too distant to make out specific words, but the tone suggested routine rather than urgent activity. Alina woke Sylvie immediately, communicating the threat through hand signals that had become second nature during their brief time together. Sylvie listened carefully to Alina's report before conducting her own assessment of the situation, using techniques that allowed her to pinpoint the location and direction of movement for the distant patrol. The German forces were following a search pattern that would bring them within a few hundred meters of the team's position sometime before dawn. Not close enough to guarantee discovery, but near enough that any mistake in concealment or noise discipline could prove fatal for everyone involved. Sylvie made the decision to move immediately rather than risk detection by remaining in place. The team packed their equipment with practiced efficiency and began a careful withdrawal toward higher ground that would provide better defensive positions if combat became unavoidable. Alina found herself impressed by the smooth coordination that allowed 5 people to move through difficult terrain in complete darkness without a single verbal command. Every member of the team understood their role perfectly, responding to subtle signals that communicated complex tactical information through gestures barely visible even to trained observers. The march continued until nearly dawn, when they reached a rocky outcrop that offered excellent visibility in all directions while providing natural fortifications that could be defended against superior numbers if necessary. Alina was exhausted by the physical demands of moving through rough country while maintaining constant vigilance, but she was also exhilarated by the realization that she had successfully performed her assigned duties under genuinely dangerous conditions. As morning light began filtering through the forest canopy, Alina could see their destination for the first time. The German communications facility occupied a valley approximately 3 kilometers away, its radio towers and defensive positions clearly visible through the gaps between distant trees. The installation appeared larger and more heavily defended than intelligence reports had suggested, with multiple guard posts and what looked like armored vehicle emplacements. Sylvie studied the target through military binoculars, while the rest of the team prepared equipment for the assault phase of their mission. Alina watched the preparations with growing understanding of how much planning and coordination would be required to successfully attack a defended position without suffering catastrophic casualties. But as Alina observed the German facility, she began to notice details that troubled her in ways she couldn't fully explain. The defensive positions were manned by soldiers who appeared to be following standard security protocols, rather than the heightened alertness that would indicate awareness of imminent attack. Guard rotations proceeded with mechanical regularity that suggested routine rather than emergency preparation. Most puzzling were the civilian vehicles Alina could see parked near the main facility building. Cars and trucks that bore no military markings, but seemed out of place in what was supposed to be a purely military installation. Alina mentioned her observations to Sylvie, who examined the facility more carefully before reaching conclusions that would fundamentally alter their mission parameters. The intelligence they had received about the communications facility was apparently incomplete or deliberately misleading. What they were observing wasn't just a military target, but a complex that included civilian personnel whose presence would complicate any attack significantly. The moral and tactical implications of this discovery required immediate consultation with higher command authorities. Sylvie attempted to establish radio contact with their base, only to discover that German forces were jamming communications frequencies throughout the region. The team was operating without external support or guidance, forced to make decisions that could affect far more than just their own survival. Alina found herself participating in discussions about target selection and civilian casualties that went far beyond anything she had expected when accepting this mission. The intelligence she carried to London had made her a courier, but circumstances were transforming her into something much more complex and morally ambiguous. The team spent hours debating their options while conducting detailed surveillance of the facility below. Alina contributed observations that proved surprisingly valuable. Her months of experience reading human behavior in dangerous situations allowing her to interpret activities and patterns that escaped notice by operatives focused primarily on military considerations. As afternoon approached, they reached a decision that would test Alina's resolve in ways she had never anticipated. The communications facility would be attacked as planned, but with modifications designed to minimize civilian casualties, while still achieving their primary objective of disrupting German communications capabilities. Alina's role in the operation would expand beyond simple observation to include responsibilities that would put her directly at risk, while potentially compromising her ability to complete her original mission. She was being asked to choose between her duty as a courier carrying vital intelligence and her obligation to support teammates who had risked everything to help her reach this point. The choice Alina made would determine not just the success or failure of their immediate mission, but the trajectory of everything that followed. Because somewhere in that valley below, amid the radio towers and defensive positions, waited encounters that would challenge every assumption she had made about war, duty, and the price of fighting for causes that seemed clear from a distance, but became infinitely more complex when viewed through the eyes of those who actually pulled triggers and made life-or-death decisions in the crucible of combat. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the forest in shades of gold and amber that made the world seem peaceful despite the violence being planned within its embrace. Alina checked her equipment one final time, verified that the intelligence she carried remained secure, and prepared to descend into a valley where she would discover that the most important battles weren't always fought against the enemies you expected to find. The descent into the valley began just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the tree line, leaving Alina's team to navigate through darkness that seemed to swallow sound itself. Each step down the rocky slope required careful placement to avoid loose stones that could tumble ahead of them, announcing their approach to any German sentries alert enough to distinguish between natural forest sounds and human movement. Alina found herself moving with a confidence that surprised her body having adapted to the rhythms of tactical movement during the past weeks of training and travel. The weight of her pack, the careful balance required for silent progress, even the constant awareness of her teammates' positions had become as natural as breathing. She was no longer the bookshop clerk who had stumbled through her first courier mission, but someone who belonged in this world of shadows and whispered communications. Sylvie had divided the team into two groups for the approach phase. Alina would accompany the primary assault element targeting the main communications building, while two operatives positioned themselves to create diversions that would draw German attention away from the critical objectives. The plan required precise timing and flawless execution, with no margin for error once the operation began. As they moved closer to the facility's perimeter, Alina could see individual German soldiers manning their guard posts, cigarette embers glowing like fireflies in the darkness. The defenders appeared relaxed, following routine patterns that suggested they had no awareness of the threat approaching through the forest. Their casual behavior was both reassuring and somehow disturbing to Alina, who found herself thinking about these young men as individuals rather than faceless enemies. The first guard post was eliminated with surgical precision that left Alina both impressed and shaken. Sylvie moved like a shadow, approaching from behind cover that rendered her invisible until the moment she struck. The German sentry simply collapsed without a sound, unconscious rather than dead, bound and gagged with materials that would keep him silent until long after the operation concluded. Alina watched this demonstration of professional skill while grappling with emotions she hadn't expected to feel. Relief that the guard had been neutralized without being killed mixed with growing awareness that her teammates were capable of lethal violence whenever circumstances required it. The line between necessary action and unnecessary brutality was thinner than she had imagined during training exercises that used targets instead of human beings. The communications building loomed ahead of them like a concrete monument to German efficiency, its walls thick enough to withstand artillery bombardment, its windows positioned to provide defensive fire in all directions. Alina could see the glow of electric lights through blackout curtains, evidence of activity that continued even during night hours when most military facilities reduced their operations to essential personnel only. Sylvie signaled for the team to halt while she conducted final reconnaissance of their target. Alina used the pause to check her own equipment and mentally rehearse the role she would play once they gained entry to the building. Her job was to locate and photograph specific documents, while the technical specialists destroyed equipment that couldn't be captured or removed. But as Alina watched the building, she began to notice details that hadn't been visible from their distant observation post earlier in the day. Laundry hanging from windows on the upper floors suggested living quarters for personnel who resided permanently at the facility. Cooking smoke rising from a chimney indicated food preparation for a larger group than would be present for a simple communication station. Most troubling were the sounds Alina could hear through the building's walls when wind conditions carried audio in their direction. Conversations in multiple languages, including what sounded like French and possibly Dutch or Flemish. The presence of non-German speakers suggested either prisoners or civilian workers, whose status would complicate any operation designed to capture or destroy the facility. Alina shared her observations with Sylvie, who listened with growing concern before conducting her own assessment of the situation. The intelligence they had received about the facility was proving inaccurate in ways that could fundamentally alter their mission parameters. What they had expected to find was a purely military target that could be attacked without moral ambiguity. Instead, they were facing a complex that appeared to house civilians whose safety would need to be considered alongside military objectives. The presence of non-combatants didn't necessarily make their mission impossible, but it required careful planning that hadn't been part of their original preparations. Sylvie made the decision to proceed with a modified approach that would allow them to gather more information before committing to irreversible actions. Alina would accompany a reconnaissance element that would attempt to gain entry through service areas that appeared less heavily defended than the main entrances. The approach to the building's rear entrance required crossing open ground that offered no concealment from observers in the guard towers. Alina found herself crawling through wet grass that soaked through her clothing while maintaining perfect silence, despite the discomfort of movement that seemed to last for hours but probably consumed only minutes. When they reached the building's foundation, Alina could hear conversations through the walls with startling clarity. German voices discussing radio schedules and message traffic mixed with other languages she couldn't identify, but which definitely included French speakers. The linguistic diversity confirmed her earlier suspicions about the facility's true purpose and composition. Sylvie located a service entrance that appeared to be secured only with standard locks, rather than the sophisticated systems protecting more sensitive areas. Alina watched her teammate work with lock-picking tools that opened the door with almost supernatural efficiency, providing access to corridors that stretched into the building's interior. The hallways they entered were lit with dim emergency lighting that created pools of visibility separated by stretches of shadow that could conceal movement, but also hide potential threats. Alina followed Sylvie through passages that seemed to extend far deeper into the building than its external dimensions suggested, passing rooms whose purposes remained mysterious behind closed doors. They encountered their first indication of the facility's true nature when Sylvie opened a door that revealed a dormitory filled with sleeping figures, whose clothing identified them as civilians rather than military personnel. Alina counted at least 20 beds, most occupied by people who appeared to be workers rather than prisoners, though their exact status remained unclear. The discovery forced another reassessment of their mission parameters. Alina found herself wondering whether these civilians were voluntary workers supporting German operations or conscripted laborers forced to provide services against their will. The distinction would be crucial for determining how to proceed without causing harm to people who might be victims rather than collaborators. Sylvie led Alina deeper into the building toward areas where the actual communications equipment would be located. They passed through sections that resembled office buildings more than military installations, with typing pools and filing systems that suggested extensive administrative functions beyond simple radio operations. The scale of the facility was becoming apparent as they explored corridors that seemed to branch endlessly in all directions. Alina realized they were inside something far more significant than a communication station, possibly a regional coordination center that managed German activities across multiple countries. When they finally located the primary radio room, Alina understood why this facility had been selected as a target worthy of such an elaborate operation. The equipment she could see through observation windows represented some of the most sophisticated communications technology available, capable of coordinating military activities across vast distances with encryption capabilities that would be invaluable to Allied intelligence services. But the room was occupied by personnel who were clearly working through the night shift. Their activities focused on message traffic that appeared to be routine rather than emergency communications. Alina watched German operators processing what seemed like ordinary administrative messages, alongside more sensitive materials that would require careful handling to avoid detection. Alina's story reminds us that the greatest acts of courage often begin with the smallest decisions to help another human being. Her journey from bookshop clerk to resistance courier proves that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they choose conscience over comfort. In a world that seems increasingly divided, Alina's courage to see humanity in unexpected places offers hope that compassion can triumph over hatred, one choice at a time.